And so I encourage all of you to accept responsibility for your situation in life. Because if you accept responsibility for your situation, you also have the power to control it. Right? I know it sounds kind of weird, but if other people are to blame, then I can't do anything about it. Because I can't change other people. You can try, but it's not going to work. So let's kind of get started. So a lot of times people kind of assume that, if they're highly rational, that they're like not emotional. So we see this a lot in argument, right? Where people will kind of be like, oh, this person this person is getting emotional, and therefore their argument is wrong. And it's really tricky because we, especially like a lot of people of our generation will think of themselves as like rational thinkers. And part of the reason that they conclude that they are a rational thinker, or I am a rational thinker and someone else is not, is because this person is displaying emotion and I am not displaying emotion. So if this person displays emotion and I am not displaying emotion, then I am the more rational thinker, therefore my argument is more correct. And it's almost like we sort of say that the display of emotion becomes like a point against our rational argument. Like if I make a rational argument, but I make it emotionally, if I have an argument, but I make it emotionally, then it becomes not rational. Which is kind of interesting because that's not really the case. So I know a lot of people think of themselves as like very rational thinkers, but if you really like engage them in conversation and they don't think of themselves as emotional, like you can actually uncover a lot of emotion very quickly. And the simplest way to tell, someone who thinks that they're a rational thinker, that they're, a simple way to elicit emotion is to tell them that their logic is wrong. Just be like, no, bro, like the logical chain that you are outlining is incorrect. And if you say that, you will see an emotional response. The emotion will definitely come right out, right? So it's kind of interesting because we sort of think about rationality and emotionality at opposite ends of the spectrum. And in a sense, that's actually somewhat true. And we'll get to the neuroscience in a second. But there is reciprocal inhibition between our cortices and our limbic system. So our cortices is where a lot of our higher order thinking comes from. And there's a limbic system is where our emotions come from. And what reciprocal inhibition means is that our cortices will suppress our emotions and our emotions will suppress our cortices. So there's a reason why some people think that, if you're emotional, you're not going to be thinking rationally. So there's some truth to that. But that's unfortunately not entirely how the mind works. So the first thing that we want to kind of dig into is that skill at argument does not necessarily make you rational. So a lot of times I'll see this in couples counseling where like one person is like a better debater than the other person. And so anytime they have a conflict, like one person is like able to form their arguments more like coherently, and therefore they will win the argument. And then they assume that because they won the argument, that their logic and their rational thinking is superior to the other person's. It's kind of interesting, right? Because if I win an argument, doesn't that imply that the rationality that I used is more correct than yours? But hold on, like let's take a step back and recognize that like debate and skill at argument is like a skill. So if I had someone who was a master debater, and I even like I gave them a bad premise to argue, they would be able to like even take something illogical and actually like outmaneuver someone who is not as good as a debate. Right? So one way that we sort of justify the rationality of our argument is if we can out-argue someone else. So if I can convince someone or if I can outmaneuver someone using my skill of argument, then I must be correct. But that's not actually the case, right? Because skill at argument is just skill at argument. It doesn't actually mean that you're logically correct. It just means that you're better at outmaneuvering another person. And so this is kind of interesting because, like, just because you're able to outmaneuver someone doesn't actually make you right. But then you kind of scratch your head and you're like, but then what does make me right? How do I know if I'm rational if like skill at argument doesn't mean I'm right? And so it's kind of interesting because if you really look at it from a neuroscience perspective, what you can actually find is that emotions can hijack your skill at argument, okay? So let's take the example of like someone who's in denial about being addicted to alcohol. So this person, people can approach someone who's addicted to alcohol and in denial with the most logical argument. And emotionally, if this person is not willing to accept that they have a problem, their rational mind will come up with all kinds of counterarguments, and you will never be able to convince them that they have a problem, right? Unless they are willing to entertain the idea that they have a problem, you will never be able to convince them. So it's kind of interesting because if you really look at the mind, what we find is that your skill at argument can be hijacked by other parts of your mind. And so, you can kind of get emotional. Like if you get someone who's like very good at arguing, you get them riled up, they will argue with you. Their emotion will kind of fuel that argument. And then like you will never be able to convince them that they're wrong. And they may even be able to outmaneuver you, and they will walk away from that interaction thinking that they're right. And so if people are kind of confused about that, all you have to do is look at politics, right? Because when I hold a political belief and someone else holds the opposite political belief, both of us within our mind are convinced that our belief is logical and justifiable. No one in politics says, my belief is idiotic. We always try to say, oh, this other person isn't thinking clearly, they're emotional. And both sides will say this all the time. And if you really ask the person, is your belief logical? They'll say, of course it is. That's why I believe it. But if we really get into it, what we actually realize is that's not the case, because logic may exist objectively, but when you take logic and you stick it in a human brain, some weird stuff starts to happen, okay? So let's try to dig into why rational thinkers are actually quite emotional, and how, unless you understand the emotional aspect of your thinking, you will never sort of be thinking properly, okay? So it starts with this. So a lot of people will say, okay, I'm not feeling emotional, therefore I must be rational, right? And that's kind of interesting, but if you look at it, some people are alexithymic. And so what that means is that they've actually trained themselves or been conditioned to turn down the volume on their emotional signals. If you actually look at these people, their EQ or emotional quotient is lower than other people who are not alexithymic. And so I know it sounds kind of weird, but just because you don't feel emotion doesn't mean that there isn't emotion that's active in your brain. So we all have this part of our brain called the limbic system, and the limbic system is how we feel emotion. And I know it sounds kind of bizarre, but you can even look at cases of people, and we'll show some papers quickly. But you can look at people who have, neuroscience things going on that suppress their ability to feel emotion. And what you actually find is those circuits of the brain aren't turned off. They're actually turned on and acting in some way, although there isn't awareness that the emotion is present. So I know it sounds kind of weird, but if you engage in a logical argument with someone, the emotional parts of your brain are not going to be non-functional. They'll be functional, and some amount of awareness will be suppressed. So one of the places that we actually see this is actually in schizophrenia research. So if you look at people with schizophrenia, their experience of emotion over time can be blunted or diminished. So people with schizophrenia can develop something called flat affect, which means you can't see emotion in their face. So even though they could be experiencing emotion, the visibility of their emotion is kind of there's a break between these two circuits of your brain. And similarly, what we see in alexithymia is that the emotion is active on some level in your neuroscience and is actually hijacking your rationality, but your experience of it is not present, which sounds really, really weird, but that's because sort of you're just not aware of it, but it's absolutely there, okay? So this is where let's kind of turn to a little bit of research, okay? So we're going to explain this principle a little bit better. So inhibition of action, thought, and emotion, a selective neurobiological review. So this review goes into a lot of information that is less relevant for us, but is really interesting. Talks about, inhibitory circuits for thoughts and actions and emotions. But here's the important part for us. So emotional dysregulation is a characteristic of a variety of forms of psychopathology, and dysregulated fear responses play a prominent role in blah, blah, blah. By studying extinction, researchers have made substantial progress in understanding the psychological and neural mechanisms underlying the inhibition of conditioned fear responses. Below, we review evidence indicating that the that's ventromedial prefrontal cortex, amygdala, and hippocampus are critical brain regions involved in fear extinction. Okay? So let's just think a little bit about what this is saying, and I'll try to translate for y'all. What this means, if we're talking about inhibition of a conditioned fear response, what that essentially means is that I have a fear response that is activating, but there are parts of my brain that are kind of inhibiting it or suppressing it. So the fear is there, and there are certain circuits of my brain that will actually like go out of their way to try to suppress it from actually happening. And this is sort of what we see in cases of like alexithymia and argument, is that a lot of people won't feel emotional, but there are actually emotional circuits that are active that are being inhibited from like presenting in a particular way by other circuits of our brain. So our ventromedial prefrontal cortex, which is where a lot of our, logic and executive function comes from, actively will inhibit the experience of things like fear or other kinds of emotions. But the really interesting thing is that there's reciprocal inhibition. So sometimes what can happen is even though we're trying to inhibit that circuit can activate and actually shape our rational thinking, okay? I know it sounds kind of weird. But if you have a friend who's very emotional, let's say that I'm afraid that my partner is cheating on me, then what happens is that emotion drives my rational thought process, right? And then I start thinking all these things that if my friends try to disprove me, I'm like, no, man, like I'm texting her and she's not answering. But it's like, dude, maybe she's asleep. It's like 1 a.m. No, man, like she's not answering because this, right? And you can try to argue with that person as much as you want to, but as long as that emotional circuitry is hijacking their rational circuitry, they will never like respond to your rational argument, right? And so this is kind of the tricky thing when it comes to the human mind, is we have rational thoughts and we have emotional thoughts. And we tend to think that if I don't feel the emotion, then I must be rational. But actually what I've discovered, and this is sort of what what the yogis discovered as well, is that if you are not aware of your emotions, if you can't feel emotions, that doesn't mean that emotions don't exist. That just means that the action of emotions is not visible to you. And I would argue that the less emotion you're able to feel, the more likely your rational thinking is actually hijacked by your emotions. And this is where things like cognitive biases come from, right? So if we think about these things in psychiatry, like cognitive biases, denial, defense mechanisms, projection. So what does all this crap mean? Like, why does this happen? Why do we have a cognitive bias? Why do we have these psychological defense mechanisms? When I am in denial, that's a psychological defense mechanism. So what am I defending against? I'm defending against emotion. So what we tend to find is that hyper-rational thinkers are not actually hyper-rational. They're actually, the conclusion that they come to is, I'm a rational thinker because I don't feel emotion. Whereas what's more likely, and this is what we get trained in psychiatry, is to recognize that there are all these psychological defense mechanisms which manifest as rationality, but that person is not able to experience the underlying emotion. And if they're not able to experience it, it's essentially going to hijack your skill at argument and start disproving people right and left. So it's kind of bizarre, but at the end of the day, what I've seen is that if you want to determine whether your thought process is truly rational or not, the main question you need to ask yourself is, am I aware of my internal emotional state? And until you become aware of your internal emotional state, there's a decent chance that your thinking is not actually going to be rational at all, but you'll be recruiting all these weird psychological defense mechanisms and like kind of hijacking your skill at argument to prove other people wrong, but really you're the one who's like woefully incorrect. It's really bizarre, but that's kind of how it works. So if you want to become a more rational thinker, I know it sounds kind of weird, but what you actually need to do is gain emotional awareness, right? Because when we really think about a rational thinker, like someone who makes good decisions, it's the person who says, oh, like emotionally, I feel embarrassed going to a party. But now that I'm aware that I have that embarrassment, I can act in spite of it and kind of do the right thing. Whereas what'll happen if we're not careful is that emotional embarrassment will be like, it's not worth going to. Right? Oh, I'm not even going to have a good time. Oh, it's so far away. I come up with all of these. I know this is a weird word. I know you guys have never heard this word before. It's a very rare Sanskrit word. Rationalizations. Right? And what does that mean? Like, what is a rationalization? It's our brain's emotion hijacking our skill of argument to come up with a logical response that other people are not able to argue against, right? It's crazy. We even have words in our language where we intrinsically understand this stuff. We intuitively get this when we use the word rationalization. And what we tend to find is that the more unaware you are of your emotions, the more your rational thought process will be filled with rationalizations instead of real logic. So that's how, you got to be careful. But if you consider yourself a rational thinker and you don't experience much emotion, there's a decent chance, and you guys may know people who are like this too, that actually your emotions are actually running the show from behind the scenes, and that your rational mind is a puppet that's being controlled by your emotions. Yeah, people are mentioning Ben Shapiro and stuff like that. Yeah, so like I'm not surprised that people are drawing these correlations. I don't really know. Like I try not to make judgments about people unless I've talked to them personally. But when someone is saying rationalizing is making excuses, absolutely, right? So this is where, if you kind of think about it, like, why are you making an excuse? It's because there's an emotional pain that you want to dodge. It's a protective mechanism. That's why we call them defense mechanisms. So when people are kind of asking the question, okay, how do I become more aware of my emotions? So I know it's kind of weird, but like, if you just actually sit down and pay attention, you may discover that there's a lot of stuff about your life that your mind is really working hard to avoid, right? Because like, if we open that can of worms, if we do say, okay, like this was my fault, or I am an addict, holy crap, what does that mean? It means I'm letting my kids down. It means I'm letting my spouse down. It means that I'm disappointing the people at work. It means that like I have a problem that like I don't know if I can fix. Because I can fix all of the rational things in my head because my mind is telling me it's just this. You can fix that. But there's a lot of fear with like letting go of your defense mechanisms and like, in a raw way, like facing your problems because maybe you can't fix the addiction. You can fix all this other stuff, which you keep on saying is the problem. No, it's not. Video games aren't the problem. The problem is I'm just like not disciplined enough. I just need to be more disciplined. I wish I was more disciplined. This isn't the problem. It's not the marijuana that's the problem. Like the marijuana helps with my anxiety. Like the problem is that the capitalistic society and student loans and all this, like the world is going to hell. It's not marijuana that's the issue. It's like, look at all of these things. This is what happens, right? Once the emotions hijack the rational part of our mind, we come up with a lot of evidence, which is compelling. It's not like our mind thinks false things. It's just really selective. And it's like, no, man, like the reason that you're not doing well in life is absolutely because of capitalism, which is fair. Like you can say that there's a predatory work environment, you're not logically incorrect there. It's just blaming, the universe is an awesome way to give a pass to yourself, right? Because then it isn't your fault. Yeah, like everyone else is wrong, And I see this a lot with like people who are, I don't want to get into this, but there's some things that are medically, we know are like medically dangerous, right? So there are certain aspects of the self. And in our desire to be like an accepting society, what some people have started to do is normalize or even promote things that are like scientifically medically dangerous. And they say like, oh my God, like I don't want to deal with the shame of a particular aspect of myself. Therefore, I'm going to demonize all of society instead of like take care of myself, right? And as a scientist, like as a medical doctor, like there's clear, there's like a clear right answer about what's healthy and what's unhealthy. And then once we get into these like psychological like games of like, I don't want to deal with the shame that I feel internally. Therefore, I'm going to play a really cool trick. Y'all ready for it? I don't have to be ashamed if there's nothing wrong. Right? So I have an OP technique to deal with internal shame. Just blame society and normalize the way that you are. It comes back to if you don't deserve me, if you can't handle me at my worst, you don't deserve me at my best. Like, why do I need to grow as a person? Like, people need to be more accepting. It's not my problem that I'm an asshole. People need to be more compassionate. It's their problem. Everyone is so mean and cruel nowadays. Like, I don't need to improve. People need to be nicer to me. And now everyone's so be careful, because now everyone's like, oh, like you're taking your particular, the people that you dislike or you disagree with, and what is your mind doing? Yeah, the people that disagree with me, they're the ones that do what Dr. K is talking about. They're the idiots that he's talking about. Yeah, that's them. That's the take your pick, conservatives, liberals, this person, that person. Take your pick. Whichever side of the argument you're on, what are you doing right now? You're putting the other people that you argue against. You said, Dr. K, that's these people. No, bro, like you could be that people. That's what we're saying. We're not talking about the people you argue against. We're talking about you. It's crazy. Do you see how your mind does that? It's so damn quick. Because now it has a justification to disprove the other person's point. It's like, yeah, I'm right. Dr. K said so. Be careful. Okay? Be careful. We're not here to talk about other people. This stream is here to talk about you. Right? Why do you take this piece of juicy evidence? Because damn, it's a good piece of evidence. Did you guys see that scientific paper, man? Oh man, it's definitely this person. And it could be, you could be right? I'm not saying that they're not like that. But just be careful about how your mind, what does your mind emotionally feel when you assign this idiocy to your opponents? Oh my God, doesn't it feel so good? Feels so good. Oh, look at these noobs. They're like this. And then look at that emotion. And what do you think that emotion is doing? It's hijacking your rational circuitry. And it's saying like, oh, look, now I get to feel better than them. That is my favorite thing to do, is I need to be better than that person. Oh, that feels so damn good. Be careful. Be careful. Okay? Be careful. So we're not saying, and this is the key thing to remember, when your emotions hijack your rational circuitry never comes up with stuff that's wrong. Okay? This is the tricky thing. Because you think, oh, doesn't that mean my rational circuitry is wrong? Incorrect. It's selective. Huge difference. It's incomplete. Right? So if I ask a girl out, girl says no. Then I feel hurt, rejected, and ashamed. Oh my God. Until I start dissing her, and it's like, oh, she doesn't deserve me. Oh, then I don't have to feel ashamed. Her loss. Oh my God. I get to feel better about myself. I was doing it as a favor. It was charity on my part. And if she doesn't want to accept the charity, I'm too cool for her. Beautiful. She wasn't even that attractive, right? And it doesn't have to be, I'm just saying that because, my experience when you speak in the first person, I adopt a heteronormative masculine perspective. Because these are the thoughts that I had when I was like 19 years old, a freshman in college, asking a girl out, and when she turned me down, that's what my mind did. Came up with all these reasons that protected me from feeling ashamed of myself. Right? It goes the other way. Like, dudes can do this with dudes. Women can do it with dudes. Women can do it with women. It doesn't matter. It doesn't even have to be romantic. Right? It can be like a job interview. It can be like you can invite a friend to a social event, and then they can turn you down, and then you feel rejected and like you're not good enough for them. And then the mind flips over and says, oh, like it's his loss. Right? So where I'm not trying to demonize y'all, y'all are great. Y'all are fantastic. Let's understand these parts of ourselves, right? And let's understand that it's actually okay to feel shame. It's okay to feel rejected, because sometimes we get rejected. And as we start to look into that, right, as we start to face our problems and we face like, oh, wow, like I really feel like shameful and rejected. As we start to acknowledge those emotions, then we can leverage our truly free rational thinking on it. And then we'll discover one of two things. I know it's crazy, but we're going to discover one of two things. One is, oh, crap, maybe I deserve to be rejected. Maybe there's something here that I need to get better at, right? Like maybe like I'd do a better job at romantic relationships and people would say yes if I, groomed myself. So that's how you make progress, right? You sort of notice that there are particular things you could do wrong. Other option. Maybe you'll discover that they're a toxic fucker, right? Because some people reject you and it's really not fair. Like some people reject you because they've got an ego thing going on. They've got emotional crap going on. Maybe you'll discover that there's someone in your life that persistently makes you feel a negative way, and that actually isn't fair. But you're not going to know the answer to that until you authentically and calmly look at it and face what you feel. Oh, wow, this person routinely makes me feel really bad about myself. Right? So then, like, once you're like, oh, and then it's kind of tricky. I know we're kind of going off on a tangent here. But if you're not careful, what that'll turn into is like all kinds of things to make yourself feel better. When you have a toxic person in your life and they reject you, what do you actually do to suppress that emotion? You bend over backwards for them, right? Oh, like this person rejected me. Do you want to go out to dinner on Friday? Oh, you said no and I feel hurt and rejected? Oh, it's my treat. I just got a bonus and I'm looking to celebrate. I'll pay for your food. And then the person is like, okay, fine. And then they come out, right? And then it's kind of interesting because then what happens is you start engaging in all of this behavior to avoid that feeling of rejection and propagate the toxic relationship, right? It's really tricky. But that's where, once again, the solution is still the same. As long as you're able to notice that shame, notice that rejection, be aware of it, even start to tolerate it, because that's a big part of it, not even being aware of it. Awareness is like 50% of tolerance, to be honest. And so as you're able to do that, then you're like, oh, actually, like I feel ashamed. And once you acknowledge the shame, once you feel the shame, it's no longer secretly working behind the scenes to like manipulate your behavior into propagating toxic relationships. Does rationalizing ultimately feed a negative self-image? Absolutely. So remember, the goal of rationalizing is to support whatever you feel, right? So if you look at like doomers, okay? Like doomers, actually maybe doomers is not a good example. Let me think about this. So does rationalizing ultimately feed a negative self-image? Absolutely. Let's look at someone who's depressed. So in the mind of a depressed person, they have a core feeling of low self-worth, okay? And then like rationally, they'll give you 1,000 justifications why there's low self-worth. And you can argue, I can argue with my patients. There's so much reason to live. Like you literally have 3 kids that are telling you that they hope you get better and they want to see you again and they love you very much and they don't want you to go anywhere. They're literally telling you that. And then the stronger the emotion, the stronger the rationalization. They're just saying that. They don't understand that, like, I'm causing them so much pain by being sick. They would be so much better if they could, like, worry about people who deserved their love. It's like the strength of the rationalization supports the emotion. It's crazy, right? And so it absolutely can reinforce the negative self-image. And that's why talking to people logically about why they should live doesn't work very well. I mean, it can help some. And that's where you got to acknowledge the emotion first, then you can talk to them logically about it. Someone's asking, how do you deal with a string of toxic relationships? By looking at the common variable. I'm not trying to be mean there, but like, what is it that you do? What are the emotional needs? And this is the really tricky thing, because people who wind up in strings of toxic relationships, there's something really powerful that's drawing you to that person. That's what you need to understand. Okay? It's a fantastic question. But it's this kind of thing where, like, I know it sounds kind of weird, but if you look at people who are routinely in toxic relationships, the person in the toxic relationship makes you feel the way that you feel about yourself. That is why people wind up in toxic relationships over and over and over again. They confirm what you believe about yourself. And so human beings will go for like confirmation and order over pain. So you will, like, human beings are just wired this way. It's like the way that we've evolved. We'll accept a pain that we understand and are familiar with because there's a part of your mind that's like, we can survive this. We've done it 10 times before. This is home field advantage. And so if you believe something about yourself and then the toxic person reinforces that belief, it fits. It's like, oh, that's I knew it. So it's really tricky, but that's the problem. Because, I mean, it could be circumstances and stuff like that. Like maybe just literally your social circle is filled with people who are toxic. But generally speaking, what I find is that people who engage in toxic relationships over and over and over again, I know it sounds kind of weird, but when they come into my office, we don't work on the people that they're dating. We work on them. And so I encourage all of you to accept responsibility for your situation in life. Because if you accept responsibility for your situation, you also have the power to control it. Right? I know it sounds kind of weird, but if other people are to blame, then I can't do anything about it. Because I can't change other people. You can try, but it's not going to work. But if you accept responsibility for your situation, that also means that if it's your fault that you're here, you could have done things differently, which means that you can do things differently. So it's really tricky, but responsibility and empowerment come hand in hand. With great power comes great responsibility is absolutely right, because that's the only way it works. So if y'all feel, if you're saying to yourself it's all your fault, that also means that it's within your power to change it. And that's just like, are you willing to carry that burden?